Hi, I'm Faye Shapiro, publisher at Compro, and welcome to our very first Compro Industry Membership webinar. We brought to you by Compro and the Foreign Press Association. We welcome our industry members. We welcome our guests. We welcome members of the Foreign Press Association. And we most especially welcome our extraordinary speakers. Fred Garcia, Simon will do the intro, but I can't begin to express my appreciation for your wisdom, for your friendship, for your collaboration. And Simon Locke, you are the man, the founder of Communications Match and the vice president of the Foreign Press Association. And friends, please use the chat, use the Q&A to engage. We want you to be part of this. That's the whole idea of industry membership. That's the whole idea of being part of the Foreign Press Association. And quick promo, to learn more about either, I'll put some info in the chat. We want you in Compro, we want you in the FPA. So with that promo, I now turn the floor over to Simon and Fred. Thank you both.
Thank you, Faye. And again, thanks to Fred Garcia for joining us for this webinar. Fred is actually the author of a couple of books that are actually extremely relevant at this time: Words on Fire and The Trump Contagion. So Words on Fire was the inspiration for today's webinar because Fred wrote the book in, it was published in 2020, just before January 6th. And one of the things that, that we are now in a new election cycle, just in case anyone had not noticed. We'd have to be living under a rock. Fred is the president of Logos Consulting and president and executive director of the Logos Institute for Crisis Management. He teaches at NYU, Columbia, and Wharton. He has a very illustrious background. And given what we have been seeing in the election cycle, there have been some jarring moments, and they continue to be jarring moments to this day in terms of what is being said by the different parties and candidates. And when Fred published Words on Fire, it was at the time when he was writing about how language was being used in ways that created the potential for violence. And some time after, not that long after, we saw January the 6th. One of the things that he writes in Words on Fire is that there are certain patterns to the language that is actually being used, and it actually reflects patterns of language that have been used in the past. Fred, maybe we can start with you providing some perspective on sort of the big meta picture, the way in which the language that is being used in a way is code. Can you decode it for us?
Sure. Well, first, thank you. And let me begin by thanking Compro, Foreign Press Association, Communications Match for this opportunity. One of the things I do in my scholarship and in my teaching and in my client work is I study patterns of leadership, patterns of language, patterns of stakeholder reaction to language. And about 9 years ago, I began to notice a very disturbing pattern. And that pattern was familiar. And when the 2016 campaign began in 2015, the very first announcement sent shivers up my spine because I recognized what was happening. And that was the newly announced candidate was dehumanizing and demonizing groups of people and essentially provoking fear, which is a powerful motivator. And I began to worry that the pattern is that would escalate. And I began to document the dehumanization of groups, immigrants, Muslims, others, the demonization of opponents or critics, or the news media, the delegitimization of rivals and institutions. And I began to compare it to prior incidents of violence. And what I concluded is, historically, there are 12 forms of language that have historically preceded escalation of violence, including to genocide. And it begins with dehumanization, demonization, delegitimization. It also attributes violent motive. It also scapegoats whole groups of people. And the pattern is people become accustomed to seeing people as the other. And that leads first to just incivility, the normalization of incivility. Then it leads to exclusion of certain groups. Then it leads to random acts of violence against members of those groups or people perceived to be members of those groups. Then it leads to intentional hate crimes against members of those groups. And then it leads to individual acts of terrorism against symbolic targets. And then it leads to collective acts of violence and terrorism against symbolic targets. And then it escalates from there. And I spent, and my researchers spent, a fair amount of time documenting these. We saw all 12 of those forms of language used in Mein Kampf and in the run-up to the Holocaust. We saw all 12 of those being used in the massacres at Srebrenica. And we saw 10 of those 12 used in the massacre of Rwandan Tutsi by the Hutu. I then began to compare it to the American political system, and I found that same demonization and dehumanization was being done in American politics. So, for example, a doctor in Wichita, Kansas was labeled a baby killer. On Fox News, he was called a baby killer, a baby killer, a baby killer 85 times in 1 year. And then a person went up to that doctor in church when he was ushering at a church service, shot 2 bullets into him, killed him, and later justified himself by saying he was protecting babies from the baby killer. That's the pattern. And then I compared it to the language that candidate and then President Trump was using. He uses all 12 of those forms of language. The name for that kind of language in national security and law enforcement is stochastic terrorism. And that is language that will predictably provoke someone, not clear who or when, to commit an act of violence thinking it's what the person they admire wants. So think of, will no one rid me of this petulant priest? And then they go and murder the archbishop in the cathedral. It's the same kind of thing. And people believe they are doing something noble when they commit acts of violence. So think of the January 6 folks. They think they were being patriotic because they were doing what they believed the President of the United States wanted them to do.
You know, in your book, Words of Fire, one of the things that I think you write a couple of times is that you were not sure necessarily whether Trump had the intention of actually generating actual violence. And I think one of the things that we hear a lot is that there are some people who would go, well, Trump is sort of just being Trump, right? He gets a pass. He's the imperfect vessel. But then, you know, January 6th comes along. And the question is, did that change your perspective of the intentionality of what is actually being done?
I said in the book, and I continue to believe, it's not that Trump necessarily intends violence, but he's indifferent to the predictable consequence of that kind of speech. And it is that indifference that is troublesome. Now, in the Trump Contagion, which is about COVID, I point to when in April of 2020, he took personally and resented that states were locking down to prevent the further spread of COVID. And by April, 65,000 Americans had died in 6 weeks. he was resentful of the governors, and he issued tweets saying, "Liberate Michigan, liberate Virginia, liberate Minnesota." And in one of them, he said, "And protect our Second Amendment. It is under attack." That predictably led to people heavily armed going to the Michigan State House and trying to penetrate the State House. They were carrying AR-15s and other weaponry, and they were repelled without violence by the sergeant at arms and the state police. But they came back the next day, and when I played the video for my students and for my clients, and I asked, "What does that look like?" Said it has exactly the same feel, the same sound as January 6th. It was essentially the dress rehearsal for January 6th. And we saw the same pattern of speech on January 6th when he says, "We got to fight like hell or we'll lose our country." And he also said, because when there's fraud, you are held to a different standard. You're allowed to do things because there was fraud in the election. And he also knew that there were heavily armed people. Get rid of the magnetometers. They're not here to hurt me, after being told that there were people with weapons up in the trees and in the crowd. He knew that heavily armed people, motivated by his speech, were going to march on the Capitol. And he said, "You got to fight like hell or we won't have a country." And then when he was told that there was violence happening and he could see it on TV, he put out a tweet saying, "Mike Pence disappointed us." So predictably, what happens? Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence. So whether he intends the violence or not, the violence was known by him and others to be a predictable consequence of that kind of speech and that kind of behavior. And let me say, as an ethics professor, I talk about the behavior. I don't necessarily talk about the intent. That if you commit unethical behavior, thinking you're doing something right, you're still liable for that behavior. And that's the frame or the lens through which I evaluate Trump. I don't talk about his intentionality necessarily, because I can't get into his heart or mind. I don't talk about his values. I talk about his behavior and the predictable consequence of that behavior.
It's actually interesting, right? Because you look at this in terms of words, and you can look at words and say, well, you know, they said, I said this, but then you kind of look at the actions, which actually requires a deeper focus, right? And if one of the takeaways from what you're sharing right now, maybe this is a takeaway for journalists, and it's a takeaway for all of us, is that what we really have to pay more attention to is what is actually being done versus the words that are being used that are sort of somehow or other designed to disguise, designed to disassemble, designed to confuse, designed to go, well, you know, you don't really, of course, this is not there to provide cover. What's your thought on, I'm assuming you're going to go, look, you just said actions matter. How should journalists, how should we all be thinking about this?
When I published Words on Fire in 2020, it was very hard to get the journalists I talked to take it seriously. They said, "No, you're exaggerating. Oh, there's no causality. You can't prove the connection." Now, that's what journalists are talking about all the time, because they've seen the pattern. And it's not just on MSNBC, but it's in many other places. People are now comfortable using phrases like, "That's a lie," "That's untrue." They were far more reluctant to do that earlier in his presidency, except for the Washington Post. They kept a running count of the lies. But yesterday on Chris Hayes' show, he looked into the camera and he talked about something that J.D. Vance had said, and he said, "That's a lie." And it's important, when you know that something is factually untrue, to call it out and to name it, and to not say, "Oh, he says this, but this other person says it's not true. You know that it's not true. Say that it's not true.
When you're looking at the both campaigns, they are clearly a study in contrasts. And I think it was interesting that as J.D. Vance was attacking Tim Walz's, military record, that one of the things that I think Walz said was something along the lines of, I would not consider attacking someone else's military record. There are a number of different things, and it feels quite different. Clearly, the language that is being used across both campaigns is a study in contrast. How do you see, how would you compare and contrast and provide maybe some examples?
Sure. First of all, the Harris Walz campaign is only 2.5 weeks old, and the Walz part of that is only a couple of days old. But what's fascinating is, if I were to label the two campaigns and the difference in language, it's actually a difference in attitude that then leads to a difference in language. And what is remarkable is that the Harris-Walz campaign uses a vocabulary of joy. We are joyful warriors, and they use humor, and they use light language to, even when they're criticizing other people, like the former president and now the running mate. The Trump side, and it starts at the top, but it continues down the line, is an attitude of grievance and a vocabulary of grievance. And it's also a vocabulary of deep exaggeration and mischaracterization of the other, and attributing policies to them that they don't hold. And what is fascinating is the playbook that was in place in 2015-16, the playbook that was in place in 2020 is the same playbook they're using now. They're just using it with a much louder voice and without even trying to disguise it. So, for example, on Monday, Faye and Compro published a column of mine where I predicted, no matter who the VP pick is that Vice President Harris names in the coming days, here's what we can expect the president and his surrogates, the former president and his surrogates, to do. They're going to try to dehumanize, demonize, delegitimize whoever that is, and here's how they'll do it. Those with military service are going to try to discredit it, the way they discredited John Kerry 20 years ago, and the way the president insulted and tried to discredit Senator McCain in 2015. As it happens, the architect of the swift voting of John Kerry 20 years ago is a senior person on the Trump campaign now, and he seems to be the architect of the attempt to discredit Governor Walz's military service. With respect to policies, they're going to attribute to whoever the VP pick is an exaggerated, mischaracterized view of the entire Biden-Harris administration. With respect to individual policies, they'll use language like radical left, extreme left, regardless of where in the political spectrum the person falls. I predicted that on Monday, and sure enough, within hours of the president, within hours of Vice President Harris naming Governor Walz, Truth Social came out with a post by Donald Trump saying, this is the most radical left duo in American history. There has never been anything like it, and there never will be again. Crazy, and then he misspells her name. Kamala is indeed, all caps, crazy, all caps for the remaining. I hear there's a big movement to bring back Crooked Joe. Now, that's the first reaction to the naming of a running mate. And that's frankly precisely what I had predicted. And it's not because I'm brilliant, it's because he follows a playbook. And we can recognize that playbook and we can point to him using that playbook.
You know, it is interesting to see the language, and I think one of the core questions, and there are two, right? One is it working this time? And if it's not working as effectively as it worked in the past, what might be the difference?
One of the things that's fascinating about this campaign, I happen to have a degree in political science, and many, many years ago, I worked at a political consulting firm. But I'm not an expert on campaigns. But one of the core principles I learned along the way is in a presidential campaign, you focus on the movable middle. That those who love you are going to vote for you anyway. Those who hate you are never going to vote for you. You move the middle. I don't see the Trump campaign trying to get the middle. They seem to be trying to activate their base. And one of the things we're finding a lot of, at least the news coverage, is a large number of people who identify themselves as Republican are publicly declaring that they are moving away from Trump. They voted for him in past elections, but they're not going to vote for him again. And some are even saying they're going to vote for the Harris-Walz campaign. So I don't know that it's working as a matter of electoral politics. When you look at the Republican National Convention, it didn't seem to be trying to appeal to anyone in the middle, but to its own base. And this kind of language isn't going to mobilize people in the middle. They may not notice it or they may not listen to it, but it's not going to be something that seems to attract the middle, but it seems to be something that keeps the base intact and keeps the base active and wanting to contribute money, which is remarkably one of the odd things about this year's campaign. Is it's all about getting his donors to send him money, but also putting on sale shoes, Bibles, coins, non-fungible tokens. It seems to be a money-making machine, not necessarily a let's get elected. And when he says in a rally, you don't even need to vote for me. Well, that suggests, why are you saying you don't even need to vote for me? One interpretation that I've heard on the news is, well, that suggests that they're still trying to discredit the election results like they did in 2020. They began trying to discredit mail-in ballots in March of 2020 and continued through the rest of the year. One has to wonder why he's saying you don't even need to vote for him.
You know, going back to the Harris and very new Waltz components, I saw actually a friend of mine who posted a lawn sign saying Harris and then obviously, which was the subtitle, which gave me a laugh. It's pretty clear that Biden's decision to withdraw completely changed the race, and you know, in the run up to that, we actually had Trump talking about, you know, the campaign to unify. You know, I think Biden's like focuses on unifying, the only one that you can unify. The change seems to have been reflected in also not only the change in language of the Harris campaign, but also it seemed to be the responsiveness, the speed at which something would be a response to something that Trump and J.D. Vance have been saying. What's your take on the way in which the language around the campaign changed from a Democrat perspective between Biden and Harris?
What's fascinating is President Biden, having spent forever in the Senate, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, chair of the Judiciary Committee, he was most comfortable in policy and talking policy. If you go back and look at the NATO press conference, it was a masterclass in knowing very, very complex details of foreign policy at his fingertips, but it wasn't inspiring to an electorate. And what is fascinating now is the language is about the future, it's about potential, it's about opportunity. and it's about joy. And the contrast is joy versus grievance and fear. So it harkens back almost to the Obama hope campaign. And this is the joy campaign. And political campaigns are supposed to be about the future, but much of Trump's language is grievance about the past. And he said in that first Truth Social post that I showed a moment ago, there's a rumor that Crooked Joe is coming back. That's his wish. His wish is that he was running against Joe Biden because he wasn't prepared to run against Kamala Harris, and certainly not prepared to run about Harris and Governor Walz. So this seems to have taken them completely by surprise.
It is actually Orwellian, right? And I think you've written about the comparisons to you know, from an Orwellian perspective. It's like what's truth is really, you know, false. It's actually the opposite. You look at what is actually being said as being, you know, crazy Kamala, as being the complete opposite of actually what really is going on. It is like a rational campaign against the craziness that we are actually seeing. And I wonder whether or not, again, that contrast between the two, we're at a different point in terms of audiences, in terms of voters, reading this stuff differently. You know, maybe it's the second time round. There's not the same impact as there would have been the first time round. Do you get that sense of, you know, we've just got better at decoding it? What has changed?
Let's take a moment on Orwellian. One of the things that I find fascinating is, and I'm trying to find it here on my screen, is if you go to the Truth Social app, it says, this is the big tent app. This is where you can have truthful conversations about issues that matter to you. And then when you read the posts, it's all mischaracterization, lies, and exaggeration. If you were to look up Orwellian in a dictionary, that would be an illustration of Orwellian. And one of the things that is as I wrote in Words on Fire, one of the things about that Orwell wrote in Politics in the English Language is that when politicians say things they know not to be true and citizens believe it, that encourages politicians to say more things that are not true, causes audiences to believe it. And pretty soon you have a spiral where up is down, black is white, peace is war, truth is falsehood. And in Words on Fire 20 years ago, I traced that up to 2020. From 2020 to 2024, it's been that same pattern on steroids, to the point that you have something called Truth Social, that if you were to fact check it, it's just filled with disinformation, untruths, and wild exaggerations. I'll give you just a quick example of that. This is from yesterday. What are the chances that crooked Joe Biden, the worst uppercase president in the history of the US, whose presidency was unconstitutionally stolen from him, that's not true, by Kamala, Barack Hussein uppercase, what's the purpose of uppercase, I wonder, Obama, crazy Nancy Pelosi, shifty Adam Schiff, Brian, Chuck Schumer, and others on the lunatic left, crashes the Democratic National Convention and tries to take back the nomination, beginning with challenging me to another debate. He feels that he made a historically tragic mistake by handing over the US presidency, a coup uppercase, to the people in the world he most hates, and he wants it back now. That's the quality of rhetoric on Truth Social right now.
It is to some extent, it is mind-blowing, right? But it's also what happens when there is kind of no filter of journalism that's being applied to, look, we need to make sure that what we share is factual, or it certainly used to be the case. I think one of the things, when we think of journalism being the first draft of history, the journalism, there is clearly a greater willingness, as you said earlier, to call out lies as lies. There was a lot of reticence to be able to use a word as strong as that. But it does seem as though there is this significant challenge that from a media perspective, in terms of being able to not maybe fall into the trap. If there is intentionality behind the language, and we'll give the benefit of the doubt maybe in terms of violence, if there's intentionality in terms of language, when something is written with the goal of, well, Trump wrote it, therefore we have to write it. The headline of one story I was reading, I think there were when Trump was talking about at the National Association of Black Journalists Conference, that Kamala had suddenly found that she, suddenly turned black.
Turned black, right.
Which was shocking for the audience and shocking for anyone who really heard it in its lack of truth. There were still headlines that were being written that basically restated the language that Trump was using. What is the lesson? What should be the lessons for this from the community of journalists, from communicators' standpoint?
Let me say, I have taught communication ethics since 1987, so a long time. I have taught journalists who were in my classes. We have had journalism organizations as clients at my firm. I have never myself been a journalist. I have the greatest respect for journalism. If anything, I've been in a lover's quarrel with journalism for for much of my life. I think there's a desire to not be seen to take sides that is honorable. That desire to tell it straight is an honorable desire. I think there's been an overweighting of attempt at seeming balanced as opposed to being fair. The definition of fairness being showing what we know to have happened, but there's a tendency to try to do an equivalence. And that it's in that equivalence where that attempted balance actually causes people to begin to wonder, well, is it appropriate for him to say that she turned black? In this instance, I saw far more folks saying he mischaracterized that than in previous stories. But as a matter of communication ethics, a lie is something that is false, known by the speaker to be false, spoken with intent to deceive. And sometimes you can discern that is factually untrue, and it's clearly known by him to be untrue, and it was spoken with the intent to deceive. That fits the criteria of a lie. Then you can say he falsely claimed, or he claimed this, it's not true, which is what Chris Hayes said about the attack on the military service of Tim Waltz yesterday.
One argument that's actually used by journalists, and rightfully so, right, is that there is a responsibility to, when it's an important individual, share what that person actually said. If it's a former president, we have a responsibility to share that part of the story, But it is interesting that I think this idea of false equivalence was something that came up when it was Clinton, Trump. You looked at emails versus all of the other things, and like journalism's trying to balance, okay, we're trying to do balance. And as actually Ian Williams, president of the FBA, just to put into the chat, there is a question of objectivity, spurious objectivity, when you are balancing things that are really not equivalent. What do you think? Are you optimistic or pessimistic that the lessons are being learned, both by communicators, journalists, and particularly, I think it'd be very interesting to hear your perspective about whether or not in the Harris campaign, we've talked about in the past authoritarians, the authoritarian playbook, but is there actually the other side of the equation, a playbook that says actually joy trumps the more violent message?
I think the joy message will rally the movable middle in a way that the grievance message has stopped doing. Now, let's talk about equivalence. I believe part of the strategy to impeach Joe Biden was to say, look, they've both been impeached. Part of the strategy to try to find some crime that Joe Biden committed was to create an apparent equivalence, and that would neutralize the effect of the two impeachments of Trump and now the criminal convictions of Trump. That they were trying to create essentially a reality show version of equivalence rather than actual equivalence. But so they could say, and I think hope that the journalism community would repeat, well, they've both been impeached. Well, they both have committed crimes, so as to take that off of the agenda. I think in this instance, journalists were pretty good at saying, no, that's just an accusation. There's no evidence of that. But I think that's what they were hoping for. I can say, as I've traced journalism through the Trump presidency, initially there was a real reluctance to say that anything Trump said was a lie. But as more and more journalists began to do it, many more journalists began to call it out when it was untrue. And I think there's an equivalent progression here of being more and more comfortable calling out when Trump said something in the campaign, or when J.D. Vance says something in the campaign that is demonstrably untrue. And I think it's important for journalists to be able to call that out as a civic duty. Now, one of the things I teach in my communication ethics class is, at least in the United States, there's this notion that the First Amendment, which specifically names journalism as a protected category of activity, places some kind of civic responsibility on journalists. So when journalists do their best work, they actually engage in that civic responsibility. That's why I say I've been in a lover's quarrel with journalism, is when they fail to do that. But when I look at the heroes of my lifetime, or the heroes that just preceded me, the Edward R. Murrow or the Walter Cronkite and others more recently, it's when they hold powerful people to account for when those powerful people have committed some egregious act. And this attempt at seeming equivalence is one of the ways that they, in my view, sometimes fail to live up to that civic duty.
Yeah, and we both recognize that it's not. These are very challenging questions when you're on a deadline, you've got a short amount of language, you need to get people to read stuff, and so and you balance all of that. And if I remember rightly, when they're reading the book, and there's a new question that's come up, and which will bleed into, which was I think you said something along the lines of, if you listen to a Walter Cronkite newscast today, the experience would be very different, and the response to it would be very different than what we are seeing sort of in today's presentation of news.
This was taken out of the book by my editor just to save space. You'd appreciate this as writers. I submitted a 105,000 word manuscript, and he said, we love every word of it, but you got to take out 40,000 words. and one of the things that hit the floor was this story. I had the good fortune of meeting Mr. Cronkite in 2004, about 2 weeks before the election, and after Jon Stewart had called out Tucker Carlson and Paul Begala in that famous exchange on CNN. And I asked him what he thought about his profession in 2004. And he said that in his day, the news didn't have a budget, didn't need to make a profit, but the president of CBS said it was the best investment he ever made because it legitimized everything else. But the difference between the 1960s and 70s going into the 80s is the news wasn't expected to make a profit. But now the news is expected to make a profit, and therefore ratings matter a lot. And I think that subtle shift, at least in television news, has been an important element in getting to where we are now. Again, if today the news was delivered like Cronkite did, people would turn the channel. And that's a legitimate concern. But I would then challenge journalists to, how do you keep them on the channel without resorting to playing the disinformation or other things as well? And I don't want to miss the opportunity for the questions.
So one of the questions that came in was this idea of, and we can look actually at, again, back to both campaigns. And the question is really about, how is the language that is being used in the US, which is clearly targeted towards primarily a domestic audience, but there is clearly international repercussions and perspectives being shared. How is the language that is being used, do you think that is seen in the international arena, and maybe is having an impact on statecraft perceptions about the US?
It is very clear that one of the important issues in the campaign is support for Ukraine, keeping NATO intact. And you can see that the two campaigns are completely opposite points of view on both of those, on protecting Ukraine and keeping NATO intact. There's also a need to protect Israel from Iran. And we note that there are aircraft carriers now closer to those two countries than they were some time ago. We saw a picture of the Eisenhower in the Suez Canal a couple of days ago, getting to station. And so not just what's happening in Gaza, but the bigger consequence of that is a very important national security concern. And again, the two campaigns could not be more different in their approach. So we know that the world is watching, and in particular, China is watching what happens in Ukraine, because they are looking for an opportunity in Taiwan. So there's also been an increase of US naval activity and military activity in the Pacific in anticipation of what could happen with China. So yeah, all eyes are on the United States because it's going to have geopolitical consequences.
Ian Williams also raised the point of the importance of these types of conversations in journalism, and they happen all the time. Journalists are talking nonstop about, how do you address these issues of balance, equivalency? What do you do when Trump says something? So there is a lot of those conversations going on in the industry, and I think there's a lot of the conversation going on elsewhere, right, in terms of what's actually taking place. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about what is going on now? By some measures, you can look at Harris' improvement in polling compared to where Biden was and say, well, I think the Trump campaign hasn't changed that much. If we're talking about the Harris campaign as a campaign based on joy, then by the initial metrics, you might go, well, actually, that does seem to some extent be working, but it's not, it may be incremental. What's your view?
Let me begin by saying I agree that conversations like this are critically important with journalists and among journalists. And let me say, I came of age watching the Media and Society seminars on Channel 13, run by Fred Friendly, then the president of CBS, and then later dean of the journalism school at Columbia. These are critically important conversations, and I wish we had more of them. Having said that, I'm optimistic about the future of journalism. I believe that the pendulum is still moving in a direction politically and journalistically that is less than great, but that pendulum is going to come back. And to paraphrase a famous leader about Americans, and I'll say this about the society in which journalists operate, is we ultimately do the right thing after we've tried just about everything else. And I think I'm still very optimistic about journalism. I'm still optimistic about civic society, but it's not healthy now, but it can restore health.
Well, I think that is a good moment to wrap. I actually encourage. I very much actually enjoyed Words on Fire and the Trump Contagion. One of the things that reminded me of, in particular, with the Trump Contagion and even this conversation, is that, you know, to some extent, there is a sort of sense of a collective amnesia, right? All of the things that we are talking about now, these are not new issues. These are not new formulations of language. It's all there to see if we go back and invest the time to remind ourselves what has been said. But we're all busy, right? But we have to ask ourselves, I'm assuming the question of like, how busy are we? There is actually work associated with doing all this, right? We've got to do the work. Otherwise, we are going to risk not be able to decode these coded patterns.
I agree completely. And as you know from reading the Trump Contagion and reading Words on Fire, I wrote each of those to bear witness so that we would have a record. Because I didn't see anyone accumulating that record in either of those discussions. So I'm pleased that you note that, because that was my purpose in writing both of those books.
Well, Fred, thanks very much indeed for your insights and perspective. The next webinar for the Compro industry members we will be doing in September. We actually have a Foreign Press Association webinar tomorrow, which is actually on pollsters, polls, and the Harris-Trump election. We are in the run-up to the election. There will be a lot more focus on the campaign. That promises to be an interesting one, highlighting some of the lessons and takeaways from people who are actually running the polls and some myths about polls with that we will be talking about. We actually, as the FPA, welcome new member journalists at any time. We also, communications professionals can actually join the FPA and benefit from these types of webinars as associate members. We have a category of associate members. So with that, thank you again, Fred. Thank you, Faye. Thank you for those who asked questions. We will wrap. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.